Roger is the principal partner of Diener And Diener Architects in Basel, in Switzerland. Of course, you know that there's also another important practice in Basel, and we are fortunate to have a partner from that practice also here with Harry Kruger in the audience. So it's quite fortunate. I first met Roger almost 10 years ago when he came to teach at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard when I was there. And since then, I have tried, whenever possible, to keep up with his work and the work of his practice. The work of Roger's practice is quite different from that of Herzog and de Meuron, in a way. I think both of them exhibit incredible integrity in relation to their ambitions, but I think the end results are quite different. Roger's projects have always had a systematic relationship to the city and to urbanism, and in a way continue a project which was always a difficult project for modernism, since so much of modern architecture was focused on the question of the object or the architectural object, and the emphasis was placed on its objecthood. It was always finding difficulty reconciling this condition of objecthood with the continuity of urban fabric, with the question of urbanism. And I think this is one of the things that really distinguishes the work of Diener and Diener. I think they're among the very, very few practices I can think of who have successfully and systematically continued this project of the relationship of modern architecture to the city in terms of the project of continuity. In a way, that emphasizes also probably to a certain degree the project of anonymity, an architecture that in many respects is part of the background as a sort of backdrop to the city itself. But on the other hand, when you look at Roger's work more closely, it is anything but anonymous. And the detail and the careful attention to each one of their projects, which are now mainly outside of Switzerland, though of course many of the initial projects were in Switzerland, are now happening in places like Sweden or in Berlin and many other parts of Europe. So I think this emphasis on the concept of the ordinary is one of the important parts of their practice. But as I think we've also been reminded by one of the closest friends of the school, the late Robin Evans, ordinary things contain the deepest mysteries. Please welcome Roger Diener.
Thank you very much. Good evening. So, quite kind, nice introduction. I think I had one presentation in London about 10 years ago, following an exhibition at that moment at the Architectural Foundation. And I guess that, Tony, you are the only one that 10 years later will have to suffer once more. But at that moment it was very didactical, conceptual, written presentation. So tonight it will be different. It will be this kind of more traditional stuff with a lot of slides and just presenting a series of our projects that we are working out since of course a couple of years meanwhile in Basel, and that concern other places too, of course. And there are two kind of you could say within in a kind of a categories like building types. You could also say that there are two types of projects within this kind of very simple Pevsner-like distinction that there are projects that really they have a kind of a urbanistic impact at the beginning, at least, of the project, and there is another one, another group of projects that they have to do, that they focus much more on the architectural project and the architectural object itself. And it will be about, I will of course start with this kind of urban design schemes, and then to turn more to that other group that, as a matter of fact, for the group of projects I would like to show has to do with, again, a kind of a category in terms of building times. It's extensions of buildings, mostly museums, and that there are some projects that they are built, and some, at least two of them, that they will be built within the next years. So it's also a kind of, at the same time, and in one way or the other I achieved, so it's also a kind of a chronological series. And so I would like to start with a work we did almost 10 years ago in 1993. It was like all the projects I will show, there are competition entries, and also almost all the projects we are working out and also that are realized are coming out of competition entries. The first was a project on the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, and as you might know, there was a big discussion about this kind of reconstruction of the Potsdamer Platz and the Leipziger Platz scheme. This was the master plan of the German firm of Hilmar Sattler, which was a part of a violent discussion. You might know that Rem Koolhaas left the jury because of that discussion and that choice. But within that master plan afterwards, there were a series of competitions. The biggest and today the most prominent one was the one of Davies. That means that the whole Potsdamer Platz was cut into pieces, that they were commissioned to big firms, international firms, like Davies, which represents Mercedes, or Sony, and like that, different competitions were held on, still running that, based on that site plan. So I try not to kill you by that with this instrument, and I only use it very seldom. So this Renzo piano scheme is that part, and you might know the Sony part here, and we were invited in the ABB scheme, which was that one. And it is, you see how this structure of that master plan in one way seems to be a very abstract and a very isolated, with that more complex and interesting urban fabric, which it was, as a matter of fact, the existing one at that time in 1903 still is existing. And our suggestion was was an attempt to break with this concept of those blocks, that they should be so design. And we suggested to break with that block structure. Yeah, thank you. And to organize that series of buildings the way that they still fulfilled the kind of basic conditions that we had to keep, but on the other hand, it was a series of buildings that they tried to organize themselves within this strange status in between that existing complex fabric on the upper part and that new kind of very systematic and monumental and also traditional and pattern that was suggested by the Hirmer-Sattler master plan. So I think that this project in a certain way was important to define also a kind of a different position within this Berlin discussion, which is a discussion that in one way, I follow until today also as a consulting the part of the consulting commission for the Berlin Urban Design Committee, and this was just one of the models showing this kind of a different organization of spaces within which there is not anymore the idea of traditional 19th century urbanism, of course, with the idea of the urban space as being the decisive and defining block type structures, morphology, but that the building itself becomes as an element its own weight, its own responsibility, and without being still organized within a more abstract and more rigid, at the same time, more rigid space as the traditional one. We cut on a level, I think, on 10 meters, the other buildings, of course. It's not a series of high buildings, actually. That was supposed. Actually, Giorgio Grassi won this competition with a very traditional scheme, actually, which is under construction. And within that scheme, within that urbanistic scheme, we are in charge of those two buildings which we worked out as a kind of synthesis, a synthetic form in between his urbanistic vision and our suggestions as apartment buildings, and I think they will be finished in a few months from now. So that was a first, just a kind of a first project that shows maybe in a very clear way our intervention in Berlin and some basic issues about that work. Also, this wooden model we presented, which also indicates this kind of concentration on each different building, still within the idea of a kind of a composition of elements, of course, which can become very complex, of course. Now that second project within that series is the project for Java and KNMS Island in Amsterdam. I don't know whether it's sharp. And it's an artificial island that is built in front of of Amsterdam at the end of the 19th century, and you might discover the center of Amsterdam here. And there, of course, and this area makes part of this unbelievable program of urbanization of the Amsterdam, which itself is again part of a much larger, and I think the most important European housing program at all. Now you might know, I guess, that urbanization of, partly at least, and it's a combination of two urban design suggestions, one of Jo Koenen, which is the lower one in front of you, that part of that Y-type island, as it was called, that he suggested with those, what he called super blocks, series of super blocks here, one and the second, and here should be the third. Here it's his own rotunda work. That part of the island was done by suitors within a kind of revoking the traditional historical Amsterdam stuff with canals and so on. And as a matter of fact, almost the whole island was built meanwhile with, of course, also some important contemporary contributions to housing, like a beautiful work of Hans Kohlhoff here, this second block. And as a matter of fact, the third block was submitted to another competition because there was no, there were a lot of doubts whether what was called that the gate to Java Island should be built the way it was suggested within that plan. And still here you see this urbanization of that part of the island. You might also better know those islands of Borneo, Sporenberg, which were built following the urban design suggestions of West 8. But as a matter of fact, there was, I think, there was in 1995 another competition held about what was called here Übergangsgebiet, about that area, about this block. And I think there were 3 foreign architects' offices invited, one from Spain, and Luigi Snozzi and our firm from Switzerland, and I think the last Dutch architect, which didn't try there before, was also invited. And then we finally worked on that, and that slide now is on the wrong side. I hope it's not. May I go on to see whether it's an exception or not? Yeah. So we come immediately maybe to our suggestion. As a matter of fact, we decided not to suggest the kind of gate type building crossing the street, but we suggested to divide that site within 2 different buildings, that they would also balance those other buildings around, those last buildings of the old port. As a matter of fact, here, and very few houses for the ship captains or for the shipping companies here. The large block of Kohlhof, this kind of storage, huge storage building, so a very rich and complex series of buildings and of volumes and also of weights. And we tried to find a kind of what we called asymmetric balance, following a kind of a Klee, a citation of Paul Klee, trying to find this kind of a critical stability within that scheme, within that site on different levels. Now, this drawing maybe shows better that, or might illustrate that intention. It's a beautiful drawing of Helmut Federle, a Swiss artist living in Vienna, which actually you will see another built work of his within a scheme of ours afterwards. And it shows this kind of link between those elements. And it's called constellation. And I think this kind of idea of constellation of stellar constellations illustrates that attempt. And of course, also it was a housing program contrary to the whole other part of the island, where there was a very clear turn to references out of the housing history of the European city within Suter's urban design and the one of Jo Kuhn, and we found other references that had to do with that port. Of course, trying to imagine that specific part, that Übergangsgebiet, as the port of this new urbanized area. And there are, of course, all those beautiful buildings around there, that they are so impressive and that we felt so familiar with. And so that idea about also exchange of goods and that are so important and decisive for those buildings also influenced not only the overall shape and volumes of our scheme, but also the organization, the structure of the building. Here, the one building which is a block type building with a kind of a court, and around with the access to different apartments, which you see here, almost each apartment with 3 identical spaces, one large one which goes to this kind of open corridor. Oh, I'm sorry, no, but that was not me. With that open corridor, and which opens to with sliding doors or so at that moment, to that corridor, and those are the ones, more individual rooms, but each room about 30 square meters, and with the idea that shouldn't be for a kind of a traditional housing, a traditional family housing apartments, and I think that's very important, that we try to understand the whole building within a kind of specific concept, and to try also to work it out as, of course, as radical as possible. And finally, those that building will also be now built within that floor plan. Also, there were a lot of hesitations of the marketing people. It was actually a competition for investors that they had to book one of those architects each. Now, so that other as much as the first building, the block one, had to do like this kind of exchange from the island with the city. That one is built into the water, which has of course more to do with that exchange from the water to the island actually. And is also organized with this kind of structure that is perpendicular to the water, of course. And so those apartments are organized. Those they are huge openings, and you might discover that they are slightly switched from half a brick each one window from the upper one, and also trying to avoid this kind of abstract grid effect, and trying to give to each one of those openings a kind of autonomy. And the building has in itself a kind of a complex form, that it has this kind of foreground, background, is a kind of that terrace area to the waterfront on one side, and an entrance court on the other side too. So that was a kind of already focusing one project closer. Now getting back to a more to an urbanistic concept, which is not developed so far yet as a project, is the concept for the urbanistic concept for the new University of Malmo in south of Sweden. And here you see the Malmo port area. As a matter of fact, you see almost a big part of the city. Here you see the old part of the city, and with the port area in front, a very beautiful and incredibly striking area with all the ship yards that were so important. Malmo was the largest shipyard city in Sweden, when Sweden was the second biggest ship production country in the world. And all that is left, is gone, and there is an incredible economic crisis in Malmo, contrary to Lund, which is this traditional university city, which is about 30 kilometers on the east of Malmo. And about 3 years ago, the Swedish government decided to found a university in Malmo to increase the knowledge and the quality of the formation of people living in Malmo, instead of investing money in working places, also in industry or so. They decided to found a university, thinking that on long term this is the better way, and the only way the best way to try to ensure work and prosperity. And it's a kind of an impressive socialist program. And this Malmo bought all that area to develop that university in the center of the city, following that idea that it should affect the whole city, with the idea also of a lot of programs, postgraduate programs, and also to give an access to that university to the whole city. And then there was a international competition for that area, suggesting a kind of the urban design concept for that university within that former industrial area of those shipyards. So you see here once more this area already that at the moment of the competition 2 or 3 years ago, they called that area University Island, but you see these industrial areas with mills and other buildings, some of them already transformed for university use. Actually here, this beautiful crane that unfortunately was sold and is the biggest one in Europe and looks like the Coloss of Rhodos. At least it reminded us always. And looking from Copenhagen, you might discover always that shape on the horizon of Malmo. But nevertheless, the crane is still there because and it might still hopefully remain for a certain time there. The firm buying it has no money anymore, so they left it there. Now, we suggested a kind of a development which had to do with the idea of the industrial side at one side and the concept for the universities, thinking that the university will develop always within parts that they will create their own energy and they would like to expand. And there are impressive examples of industrial complexes that show this kind of composition of very different elements built together to and create a kind of complexity which we called, at least we dared to call a kind of a urban quality. So we didn't suggest a kind of a traditional urban grid, but we suggested kind of poles of that new parts would be built, and they would be built the way that they might develop that to more complex organizations and so on. And you see that, of course, we had to show even that developed in a very far future. But as a matter of fact, the two first buildings should be the library building here and the kind of a college building for the university college building here. You see here also the railway station, so it's really in the center of the city. As a matter of fact, it's also the railway station, of course, which now became so important through the bridge that had such a strong impact also on what was going on. You see those, you can imagine also that former shipyard site, and what that are those beautiful beautiful structures that we found there. And so this was one of the competition entrance plates that showed one of those building that was for the college center building that was organized in as a series of buildings and courts, but the way that also in the upper floors there was a new concept of how teaching and practicing and research should be organized, and it had a strong impact on also the floor plans. You see above, unfortunately it's also turned around, you see above the floor plan of the library building. Yeah, so that was the suggestion for the library, and also trying to express this kind of balance between this industrial heritage of storage and so at the same time being a kind of a noble building as a kind of course, a new identity of that industrial area. And now, as a matter of fact, we worked for 2 years on all the plans for the library there, and now it was decided that this building will be built first with the library on the top. So that building will be built later, but not with the original program, actually. So the Swiss now are more smaller scale Switzerland, but still the waterfront. I will go very quickly through that. It's an important part of also of our work. It's one of those palace-type hotels in Lucerne, well-known Schweizerhof, a hotel which runs from one part to the other, quite incredible, organized, and which was a heavy debate because the hotel should be reorganized and refitted, and at the same time the owners, the owner family wanted to demolish this part of 1859, which consists of different buildings. Part of it a very important hall, public hall within that hotel, a beautiful one with also a historical with a lot of history, and they wanted to sell all to a supermarket firm here, to build here that element together, really put together with the hotel. And there was a lot of public discussions about that, and finally there was also in last moment a kind of little small competition, and this you see already that complex part. I have shown you that waterfront here, the hotel here, this old part that was built really very roughly, but beautifully, but very roughly on the backside of the hotel, which actually was the former front side of the hotel before this waterfront was built in the end of the 19th century. And with those other buildings then kept from the old part of the city. So it was all about that part, and we finally we solved that. We suggested to really to keep that part, this hall, this large historical hall, but to demolish the huge kitchen and other buildings, and to build a separate freestanding building for that supermarket, and the extension within the whole that was supposed to be part of the hotel here. So that was finally done, and after along this all those discussions about and everybody was relieved that this building, this part could be kept, and therefore we got probably also a little bit more freedom within this kind of historical site to work on our new element here. I mean, so it is a very simple hall type building we suggested for this kind of supermarket, so without any, and in the upper floors there is part of the cultural program of that a supermarket firm to also a kind of a teaching program, cultural program. So there is a school above it. And this was the other building, more complex within the also morphology of the and the type of extensions that were at this hotel since 1945 was always running with those extensions. So we also here were following the same strategy. So finally we built that new element which was freestanding and has something might look and might remember maybe a market hall or so, and there is a little tiny church which now got this kind of reciproc building and also freestanding. Both buildings also they look quite monumental. They are small in scale compared with the buildings behind to the waterfront from the hotel. So that's those school also part of this. Not so. It's not part now. Now the last of those build projects and extensions now is a museum in Biel in Switzerland, between a small city between Bern and Basel, and this former hospital from the city was used later. It's in the 20th century as a school, still as a hospital until 1950. Afterwards, as a school, and in 1992 or so, it was converted, but to a cultural center with exhibition space and for photography, for photography, for fine art, and also for a cinematheque. And they got a kind of donation to do an extension. There was already that first intent. There was this extension in the 30s on the left side, which is an elderly home until today, and will keep that another 5 years before it will also become part of that museum. You see that specific topography. It's just quite a specific site which keep on the spot to those mountains, which are the Jura mountains, and contrary to that traditional building. Of course, our concept was for the extension was much more marked by that fact. As a matter of fact, what we suggested is, you see this, the old building, the extension of the 30s, and we suggested another extension, creating again this kind of free balance between those elements, even thinking that it might be another extension in a future. And the program was very simple. It should be a kind of an entrance, open entrance hall. There should be exhibitions, another exhibition spaces, larger ones in the upper floor, which you might see there, of course, and one large hall with a large space for a zenith light on the top. So, and we really suggested just this kind of overlapping those three functions, and also it was a public competition. I think our scheme was the only one that didn't try to do more than just overlapping those demands. And you see that the building is marked by that incredible site, and the space is becoming larger and larger, the upper floors higher and higher too. Not so spectacular as it might look there, and it is also that you also meet them always on the first floor. You meet on half floor between the first and the second floor of the old museum. So it is a kind of a smooth extension, working with the existing staircase and the new building, like turning around, embracing the old one. It's not the idea of the counterposition of the old and the new. Also, the new element is in itself a very specific element. So those were the transformations we almost left until the radiators, that they are like dogs watching the rooms. We kept all those elements from the hospital. We didn't have the money, and those are those rooms with these openings that there is this kind of cabinet type series of spaces, exhibition spaces, by turning around that window. Those spaces also compared with the traditional enfilade, turn to rotate, to say so. Something you feel very strongly there, and there is a kind of zenith line in the upper floor with a large window just outside that space. So the space itself has a kind of a different character, but still there is this kind of link which is important to us, to that real world, not creating this kind of transcendent quality that might also be could have been another choice, but was not ours. So that's the way it looks like, and of course it's at the same time, there are some things that might remind of the old building, but of course it's in itself, it's a very autonomously organized building. Those three, you have seen those three exhibition spaces, each one with its window on the first floor. Okay, so the concrete panels with that they are done with green granite, and therefore have that green color. So this is the project for the Swiss embassy. Maybe it could be done a little bit sharper. Strangely enough, Switzerland kept the old, beside the Reichstag, the only building in the Spreebogen. I think it could be sharper. And it is this building there. This was the only view I could find. It was, of course, when Crystal did his wrapping of the Reichstag. But this is that strange building there that Switzerland kept since 1918, should become now the new embassy, which it was actually from 1918 on until the war. And all this area was, of course, a built area, but was destroyed partly by the bombs of the Allied armies, but more even by the Nazis, because here should be built the famous Ehrenhalle, and therefore they already started to clean the area for that monumental project. So that how this looked some years ago, still you see resisting even this incredible transformation, which was another heroic attitude of that former ballet, which actually was the house built in the 1871 as the house for the director of the Charité hospital. Okay, so that's the way it looked in 1995, about when there was a competition held between partly Swiss architects, partly German architects, all architects that they worked in Berlin already. So it was a specific choice of invitations. That actually was how it looked in 1911. The building was enlarged, and that only to remember really what it is about. So you see, of course, that this was to become this Regierungsmeile with Axel Schulte's scheme, and with the government building of the Bundeskanzleramt, the parliament building here, the angle of the edge of the Reichstag building, and here now with the extension, the strangely left the Swiss embassy. So our suggestion was just to build another building that in one way should remember this, of course, traditional and historical organization space there also, but on the other side should at the same time try to make that building, the old one and the new one, to become a new solitarian building complex. So, and within this tension between that idea to show the parts and to work it out as a whole, that was, of course, the bet, to say so. So the new part is about offices and so on, not so much about representational areas. They are still within that part of the existing building organized, and that's the way it looks like. I told you before about Helmut Federle, the artist. We worked with him. We invited him to do a relief already in the competition, and trying to work out those different elements the way that in one way it would become something new and complex, and keep in itself all this history that only this building could remember in one way there, because the other large buildings were, of course, new, and it is kind of an attempt to densify this experience, which is so important for Berlin. And so that's also the relief, which also balances between its autonomy and between its status as that wall, former, of course, covered wall by another building. So that's the backside. Actually, there is an incredible amount of criticism, public criticism for the moment about this project. And only yesterday evening, the taxi driver bringing me to the embassy and the one taking me back, the two asked me how Switzerland could build such a strange and disastrous structure there. But of course there are, and I mean, this building still suffers, of course, from surroundings and so on, that they are not there yet. It's like a bridge that you see sometimes, those bridges that the freeway is not yet built below, and it's only bridges are there yet. And a little bit it's about that, but maybe not only, of course, about that. So the building itself looks only like a cube, but it's a well-shaped building, and it's a kind of an open space going from the bottom to the top, always organized in different spaces. This is the kind of a loggia on the first floor with an opening to the second floor, which is a kind of open atrium again. So there is a kind of a very open. Also, it looks quite closed from for when you come here. It has a kind of a very open character too, and the wind is going through the building itself. So kind of now the last two projects are only the projects, therefore I can go very quickly through it. This is the extension of the National Gallery, Italian National Gallery for art, for modern art in Rome. It was a competition held last year, and everything is going very quickly. It is actually, there were two competitions held, one which Zaha did, one which is the contemporary part of the collection, which will go into her structure together as the contemporary art center, while the modern collection will remain within that neoclassic building from a pavilion from the 1911 exhibit for the 50th anniversary of the Italian Foundation of Italy. It was in the close to the Villa Borghese that this exhibition was held. And now it was about the second extension of that National Gallery, and that's the way with the Villa Giulia actually here, and the Villa Borghese, which you will find somewhere there, and here this monumental entrance, and from 1911, and from Bazzani, an Italian architect who did the extension the same way in 1933, and in the 1960s, 1964 to 66, this extension was never finished, was built within the logic of the 60s, of course, trying to keep a distance to the new one, but also in a way reorganizing that quite fascinating ensemble. Actually, this is the British British Institute here, and I have seen that. And there are some students, I guess, invited for summer traveling there. And now our suggestion was not to go on with this idea to keep that building there as a modern building and to rework it, but we suggested to extend the building from 1911, 1933 to do the same kind of logic, the same kind of rule as an extension. And you see that even also there is no hierarchic organization of the exhibition spaces and so, but still there are kind of references within dimensions and morphologies and so on. It's organized on 2 floors with a conference hall at the entrance. And actually what we suggested by taking back the front, which from the existing building would be here, is that we organized here another front of the building, another second main front of the building, which is not a kind of a new strategy for other buildings. They were built from the beginning like that. but it was a kind of a surprise within that series of competitions. Now this is more painful, that this is the wrong way. But the principle you might discover here, it's you see that the head of the building with this conference hall that we suggested to be organized the way that there is part of the permanent collection which is not shown, that would be kept within the conditions of storage between that front and the conference room, hall. So there, the conference hall, there would be like a kind of series of sculptures, but which would just be one after the other, and from outside it would look like almost stills of a movie, and you will see part of the sculptures maybe covered by the solid parts within the open front of the glass. So by that we also achieved in one way to balance this program of the neoclassic buildings, of course, with its sculptures and so images. And the other part is that we suggested that below, on the stairs, below the architrave, with the lettering program indicating also the institution, that you could work also with large panels on concrete blocks just put on the stairs, and by that also recreate the kind of letter program which would fit together. And now that's another visualization of that part, and that were the suggestions for the making. So as construction will even start this year. They are hurrying up there, and it will take about 2 years. Trips. Now the last one, I promise, is the project for the Zeche Zollverein. It's an incredibly beautiful landmark of it's a coal mine in Essen, and Zeche Zollverein, it's an unbelievably beautiful coal mine. It was the most efficient in the world when it was opened in 1934 with, I think, 12,000 tons daily. Impressive. And it was, I think in 1989, it was stopped. And slowly, a kind of a conversion program started. Norman Foster transformed the energy central to a design center, and there were other transformations. And there was a competition as the last one within a 10 years program of what was called the International Building Exhibition Emscher Park, IBA Emscher Park, at the beginning of last year, and about transforming the largest building of the coal mine to the Museum for Natural History and for Cultural History of the Ruhrgebiet. This is actually Norman Foster's building at the bottom. He kept everything outside. Inside there were some part of the energy machinery was kept, and within that, as a kind of background, the design center is organized. Now you have seen those very very representative axes, and there is another part of those coal mines, where are those buildings that they are really keeping the coals. Here, that huge building I speak about, where the coals arrive on the bottom about 55 years old, 55 meters high, and go through the building, and they are cleaned and sorted and organized and up through the whole building, and then there are the railways on the bottom taking it away. An incredibly expressive also process. So now how this part, which is very different, and until now this difference, this so clear difference, was not indicated so sharply. So for our suggestion, we had to insist very much on this very different character, and we also convinced in the first round, to say so, we convinced also the curator of monuments, historical sites, and but still there are some hesitations, so there will be a goal, so it will take some time finally to do it. But now to the project itself, it is an unbelievable machinery inside, and what we suggested is to keep that monument as it is, because already today it is tours are organized, and they are incredibly impressive through the whole building, and old workers still tell you how everything worked. So we said we would not suggest to ruin the monument, to build inside a museum to remind that kind of monuments. So we suggested to put the new museum above that one, and we also suggested that the whole system of railways would also relaunched, and that there is a kind of a railway station reception from which you would walk through, which is also already part of the museum, and you would walk following those storages of the museum. And as the collection has a lot to do with the everyday objects also of the museum, so it is really important that all that collection could come and go, and those containers, they are part of the railway system, and you could also you will be able to enlarge, of course, this area of storage on the bottom of the building, re-stimulating that whole process of goods coming and leaving, like in the coal mines. And the building itself, we suggested to keep it as it is. Here you see that part of that was the lower part, which is about 33 meters or 30 meters high, and the upper part, which you don't see here, but what you see here already is the suggestion for the extension on the roof, and it's your concept that, as I heard, you know already, which is an incredibly brave engineer, and suggested something unbelievable. He suggested that those structures, steel structures, which they are already in a critical status now, that by suggesting another U-shaped structure and laying it upside down and fixing it there, he would solve the existing problem of the building by putting up this other building. And when we presented our scheme, really people, as much as when I talked, were quite bored or so. We were also the latest team, but when Jörg suggested his structure, showing it with an unbelievable little model from wood he did, so really people became so enthusiastic, and finally then they decided really to follow that project. Now we suggested also another way to run this kind of historical, cultural historical museums, which they are so sometimes so difficult for visitors, and we suggested to do it more really to work much more with the collections and not to try to understand this as a kind of a presentation area, but much more to accept people and visitors within that research work that is done there, and like that those elements that they should be exhibited would be again checked as the coals were checked before actually. And there is, we call that Ruhrdeck, and within you see there is also an idea to mix a design faculty with it, and there are really large areas, and of course there will be this kind of link to this machinery I told you before, which is so impressive with the silos. And here those working areas and the studio areas, which should become a kind of a new vision, also a new start and laboratory of this transformation of the Ruhrgebiet from this former heavy industrial area to this kind of a new post-industrial area, which is running, and we suggested that other organizations should join the museum itself, and that the museum would also work much more with contemporary and research on contemporary permanent processes, and work not so much on historical issues. So that was stimulating the whole discussion about that museum, discussion which is still running, and we hope that it will finally be built. And that is also the last slide I wanted to show you on that. Thank you very much.
Did you take some questions? Maybe there are some questions. Maybe I could start just by asking you about. I think that the point that there is a lot of concern with the way things are added to, and even that the new projects or something that is new is built with the idea that it might be added to, is very much present. But I think it would be great if you could say at least a few words about the question of how things come to appear the way they do, because you put a lot of emphasis on the facts of things and the factual condition of the process. And I even know sort of lectures that you've given in the past where it's all in black and white, trying to deny even maybe the kind of the coloration and the tonalities and the variations in that. But ultimately, when you talk about things like the market hall, this fact will have some kind of appearance in terms of the green, the way that the glass works with the church and so on. And the fact of building will have some kind of representational characteristic, which might be the opinion of the taxi driver or some other such thing. And I think that maybe it's possible that you could say something about this relationship between the facts of things and how things come to appear to be what they are for others, in the sense of their kind of engagement within a larger public realm.
I mean, there is obviously a kind of an impact of, how should I say, of a refusal of kind of a traditional aesthetic research within, or an attempt also, of course, all those decisions are also marked by a kind of aesthetic research too. But it is, of course, an attempt to create those structures within conditions that they seem not to be not to be obvious forms, and to give them that kind of inner link, to say so, that would create a kind of identity which will finally turn out again as a form, but which is not organized and developed within a basic formal approach. And I think that makes those buildings also look at the same time different, but also at the same time they keep something very, very simplistic and banal, because they really don't travel themselves, to say so. And I think, I mean, for us it's a very rich research, of course, like each of us, once he focuses on a kind of a concept and research, it turns to become more open and richer. Also, it might look from outside to be very limited, but that's, of course, the richness itself of our organization of space and the city. So we feel comfortable, and but I must say that we are really not looking for this kind of public reaction. I mean, we think a building should appeal in one way, and to appeal, of course, to everybody. And I mean, the taxi driver, in one way, would count more than our judgment would count, I would say, for the overall but it is, of course, a fact that with this kind of approach, very often we scratch, in a way, a kind of level for which there is no kind of common consensus yet there, and therefore seems also to be provocative. Also, this, for us, of course, it's the contrary. We try to get the thing packed, well packed. I think that it within that composition concept, that it is also those elements. They are almost also, sometimes they are enhancing other, even buildings that they are opposite the new object. So for us, we have a very good, I was saying we have a very good feeling about it. Also, buildings are full of mistakes, but it's really, I think, a kind of a specific approach. I don't know whether I asked you any question.
Yeah. Or not. I mean, it's just that also so much of what is going on today is concerned with certain ideas of effects and certain notions of temporality, where
Yes.
I think in many of these projects you are emphasizing the question of permanences more, but these permanences seem to create their own temporal condition, like the way
Yes,
you...
I mean, you cannot avoid contemporary present and contemporary work. I mean, Maya Botta told me once that even if you're driving in South America, in a country, you are the first time you're driving from the airport to the city, you might say from each building within 5 years when it was built. If it's a 20th century building, for sure, even before. So it seems that there is a kind of contemporary mark I mean, like with architects, they have all that problem. That's also the embassy we designed 6 years ago. Now we do it very different. And of course, we try to defend now also to the taxi drivers our embassy. But Max Frisch wrote in his diaries, and I like that very much. He wrote in the introduction to his diary that he didn't change one. He didn't, when he published it years later, he didn't change one sentence, because he says that it's probably a wrong idea that you believe that you become always smarter. And so therefore we would do it, of course, differently, but even we wouldn't. I don't know whether we would do it better.
The other thing that seems to have happened in some of the recent projects, that you've kind of got rid of the idea of the corridor completely, or pretty much.
The urban corridor?
No, the corridor on the inside of the buildings, for example. That it seems that you're referring to a kind of enfilade of the interior, where the rooms have a relational condition to each other. So you don't use the corridor anymore, but you use the kind of juxtaposition and proximity of the rooms. Have you come across any problems trying to get rid of the corridor?
No, it's not a kind of specific concept. And for instance, we did do a housing scheme in Paris, and there the corridor is incredibly present in the apartments, and the whole building shape has a kind of shadow in the floor plan, which is the corridor. But of course, for instance, in the Rome project, you can only define the extension as being the new part and the different part by changing the kind of traditional setting. Sometimes it's a kind of a country that just by enhancing some elements that they are there, that you achieve this kind of link, but at the same time overcoming that existing, because that's always, of course, what we attempt. I mean, just to repeat the most stupid thing in the world. And if we consider and we work out of the existing one, the new one has to gain its quality by the difference to the existing.
So maybe there's a question. Can we get the microphone here, please?
Thank you. I have a little comment.
No, just speak to the microphone and then they'll turn it up.
I have just a little comment about your intervention in historic or monumental buildings, because as architecture is seen as irreversible process, I think your intervention in monumental or historic buildings should be reversible, because at a time when you now see it as the good thing to do, maybe 10 years later you yourself might see it not the good thing that has been done. So the intervention, I think, in monumental or historic buildings should be at a time revised or rethought about, and your intervention in historic buildings should be at a certain point reversible process.
I mean, I don't know what you mean by historical building. I mean, each building is historical. Also, our extension will be historical. I mean, what you say was one of the conditions of the Venice Charta from 1964, which I think was really the most stupid Charta about curating of monuments, because there was said there that new parts should be visible and obviously new. That was the one part, and the other one was that the new part should be reversible. And I mean, this is an incredibly anti-historic idea. You imagine all those buildings, that they were enlarged, Gothic cathedrals, Romanesque churches, that they were extended and built afterwards in the Baroque and so on. I mean, this was really one of the biggest mistakes. This Venice Charta from 1964, and I think we suffered incredibly by that. And for me, even the influential principle of non-cost suffers from that deciding that you can juxtapose the old and the new, and even to think that the new should remain outside compared to the existing is a really such a unnatural, or even physically such an unnatural idea. And I mean, really generations of, I mean, that was the building that was built in 1966 behind this National Gallery, which in one way made the existing building suffer so much because it tried to be separately, to be different, and to be the way that it is. Even this was not planned, of course. Now it will be removed even. But that is really, you think, you know, every monument is in a permanent process of transformation. And every curator of monuments will tell you that the idea that the monument is a kind of a frozen thing is completely wrong. It's a permanent process, and it's also a permanent process of transformation and even of demolition. And this is the understanding today also of the preservation of monuments, and the idea that you can make like a line, like if you have an edition of letters of, and you make your balance and you count it or so. That's a completely wrong understanding of this. Sorry, I mean, I like to be.
Don't have to be sorry.
Although you criticized the project just now, that was in 1966, then it's still negotiable for debate.
Yes, of course. That I agree. That I'm trying to do.
Anybody else? I can't stand here and ask all the questions, so go on. Let me hear from one of the two, maybe. Yeah.
It's a question specifically about your urban planning project. And so the plan for Berlin, the plan for Amsterdam, one feels that there is a tension, I guess, between, on the one hand, call it, let's say, traditional European sort of urban blast. And on the other hand, an approach which perhaps is a bit more contextual, which is a bit also more formal, which is very monolithic. That strikes me in relation to sort of blocks in Berlin, set in the master plan, that strikes me also between the Jokunen in Amsterdam, and perhaps also that maybe a thing which one might say between, say, what Federer did on the flank of the early fantasy, responding on the one hand to the history of the building, and on the other doing something which is, in some sense, at least quite monolithic and closed. And now the formal side of all this to me is, I guess, relatively familiar. I feel like I understand it. What would interest me is for you to say perhaps more about what you think about history, and perhaps specifically the history of traditional European city, whatever it is, and the other part, the other one, which could be looked upon as being quite transparent in some way, and on the other, your dimension, which quite often are quite monolithic.
I think, yes, no, I sort of understand. I mean, you know, I would say that the issues and the research and the approach, you have to make a difference to the architectural choice and to the architectural vision. Of course, what I pretend also before in the discussion of the permanence of historical monuments and so on, of course, this does not mean that all those issues can be answered exclusively the way we answer it. And I would also say that the kind of what has to do with this theory and with this attempt of an approach has for sure nothing to do with this kind of rather often rather closed and monolithic appearance, if you say. So that's really, I think, a kind of architect's choice. But this is not part of the urbanistic issues. On the contrary, because those urbanistic issues, they were more they have more to do with the idea of opening up kind of additional resources. And the architectural object might be look rather hermetic. So I think one has not to do with the other. Buildings might be from glass or from stone. That doesn't, in terms of the urbanistic issue, that does not change, would not change. I don't know whether you have accepted that. The other thing would be why you when you ask me why you have to design them so hermetic and closed, and that would be a more difficult question to answer.
That is an interesting reply. I mean, what's interesting is when you draw the line between what is urban and what is architectural.
Yes. No. I speak about the issue itself and the final form, which of course you can never explain within a permanent rule and a permanent research, or even I would say it's very different in our case. So how should I say? It looks very, very strong and rough and rock-like, if you want, in Berlin, but in Rome, of course, this kind of how should I say, of this kind of this glass panel, so will look very different, of course. I mean, it's a lot of different visions that they would. And as a matter of fact, I mean, of course, I showed you maybe 2, 3, or 4 urbanistic works out of 10. So, I mean, we have others that, of course, within a kind of existing grid, also a traditional one, blockwise, we can easily imagine to remain, and I would say the first reaction is, of course, to remain. But for some thoughts, if you understand that this block type suggestion was a kind of a very artificial concept, which really was not harmless, but was harmful towards an understanding of that complexity of that site. I would say that our reaction was even a kind of an attempt of creating a new understanding how to keep that quality, which would be called a kind of permanence within all the breaks and fractions and that exists already there. I mean, it's not a work within a kind of a sane and perfect grid.
think
So I think
you've
it's
managed to
now
somehow create this stillness in the in the room. I'm sure there are a lot of people who actually want to ask questions, but it's. I think it also has something to do with the presentation that leaves people in this state of wondering what is the right question to ask in relation to the project. For me, I think there is a lot of connections between the presentation, Roger himself, and the work, in the sense that there is an incredible spirit of generosity with this man, and I think you have to be an incredibly restrained architect to produce the kind of work that he's been doing, and I just want to thank Roger for the reflection. Thank you.